The words hit me like a physical blow as I sat in the glass-walled conference room, watching 20 pairs of eyes avoid looking directly at me. "Natalie, we've decided to restructure your position," HR Director Amanda Walsh said, her voice professionally neutral as she slid the termination papers across the polished table. "Your role will be eliminated effective today." I kept my hands folded in my lap, my expression perfectly calm despite the fact that I was 4 months pregnant and had just been fired in front of the entire executive team of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd chosen to do this during our quarterly all-hands meeting, where I'd been scheduled to present the campaign that had generated $12 million in new business over the past 6 months. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steady as I reached for the papers. Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly finding their coffee cups fascinating. Only Amanda maintained eye contact, her pale blue eyes showing not a flicker of emotion as she destroyed my career in front of witnesses. "We'll be providing a standard severance package, of course," she continued, as if firing their top-performing account director was routine business. 2 weeks' pay and continuation of benefits through the end of the month. I picked up the termination letter and read it slowly, noting every carefully chosen phrase designed to protect the company from legal liability. Position eliminated due to budget constraints. Reorganization of departmental structure. No reflection on individual performance. The lies were elegantly crafted, professionally presented, and completely transparent to anyone who understood employment law. "Amanda," I said, setting the papers down gently, "could you explain exactly which budget constraints led to eliminating a position that generated a 47% profit margin last quarter?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several executives exchanged glances, and I caught CEO Jonathan Hayes shifting uncomfortably at the head of the table. Amanda's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of annoyance. "The decision was made at the highest levels, based on comprehensive analysis of departmental efficiency," she replied, falling back on corporate speak that meant nothing and explained less. I smiled then, the same smile I'd been practicing in my bathroom mirror for the past 3 months since I'd discovered their plan. Not bitter, not angry, but the smile of someone who knew something no one else in that room could imagine. "Well," I said, gathering the papers and placing them in my briefcase with deliberate precision, "I suppose some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond the people who make them." The quote settled over the conference room like an ominous prediction. I stood slowly, adjusting my blazer to subtly emphasize the slight curve of my belly that had apparently threatened them enough to orchestrate this public humiliation. "I want everyone here to remember this moment," I continued, my voice carrying easily through the silent room, "because in exactly 18 months, you'll understand exactly how expensive this decision was." As I walked toward the door, briefcase in hand and dignity intact, I felt the weight of their stares following me. They thought they'd just eliminated a problem employee who might cost them maternity leave and reduced productivity. They had no idea they'd just made the most catastrophic business decision in Pinnacle Marketing's 15-year history. But I knew. Because for 3 months, I'd been carefully documenting every illegal conversation, every discriminatory comment, and every piece of evidence I'd need to prove that my termination had nothing to do with budget constraints and everything to do with the fact that I was expecting a baby. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I finally allowed myself to feel the first stirring of satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. In exactly 24 hours, Amanda Walsh and Jonathan Hayes would discover that some people are much more dangerous when they're underestimated than when they're appreciated. The elevator descended 15 floors in perfect silence, giving me time to process what had just happened. Not the firing I'd known that was coming since I'd overheard Amanda and Jonathan discussing my pregnancy problem in January. What surprised me was how calm I felt watching 3 months of careful planning finally begin to unfold. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. "Meeting, confirmed 2 p.m. Everything ready?" I typed back, "Phase 1 complete. Initiating Phase 2. The elevator opened into the marble lobby of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, where I'd walked through those glass doors every morning for 5 years, believing I was building a career with a company that valued innovation and results. The irony wasn't lost on me that my real education had been learning how pregnancy discrimination worked in supposedly progressive organizations. "Natalie!" The voice belonged to Marcus Flynn, my former teammate and the only person at Pinnacle who'd actually noticed the pattern of subtle hostility I'd faced since announcing my pregnancy. He jogged across the lobby, his face flushed with obvious anger. What the hell just happened up there? They can't fire you for being pregnant. Actually, they didn't fire me for being pregnant, I replied calmly. They fired me due to budget constraints and departmental restructuring. At least, that's what the official documentation says. Marcus looked confused, but that's obviously not true. You generated more revenue than any other account director last quarter. Marcus, can I ask you something? Of course. If you could work somewhere that actually valued family and treated pregnancy as normal instead of a business liability, would you? He stared at me with growing realization. Natalie, please tell me you're not just going to accept this. I handed him a business card I'd had printed exactly 2 weeks ago. The card was simple, professional, with just a company name and phone number. Summit Strategic Consulting. I mean that some opportunities only come along when you're pushed into them, I said. And some people are smart enough to recognize that being underestimated is the greatest competitive advantage you can have. Marcus studied the card. Whose company is this? Mine. As of tomorrow morning, I walked through the glass doors of Pinnacle Marketing for the last time, feeling the cool October air on my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. 6 blocks away, my attorney was waiting in her office with the discrimination complaint I'd been refining for 3 months. 6 blocks away, the revenge plan that had sustained me through months of hostile treatment was finally beginning. But first, I had a phone call to make. Caroline Morrison speaking. The voice answered on the second ring. Caroline, it's Natalie Williams from Pinnacle Marketing. Do you have a few minutes to discuss a business proposition? Natalie, I was just thinking about you. How's the Meridian campaign developing? Caroline Morrison was the Chief Marketing Officer of Titanium Industries, Pinnacle's largest client, and the company I'd personally brought in through a relationship I'd built over 2 years. What Caroline didn't know was that Amanda Walsh had been systematically taking credit for my relationship management while planning to eliminate me the moment my pregnancy became inconvenient. That's actually what I'm calling about, I said, walking down the busy street toward my attorney's office. I have some information about your account that I think you'll find very concerning. What kind of information? The kind that explains why your campaigns have been underperforming lately, despite increased spending, and why you might want to reconsider your agency relationship. There was a pause. Natalie, are you suggesting there are problems with our account management at Pinnacle? I'm suggesting that you might want to review exactly who's been managing your account and whether that person has the experience and relationships necessary to deliver the results you deserve. Are you leaving Pinnacle? As of today, yes. And I'm starting a consultancy that specializes in providing the kind of personalized, relationship-based service that large agencies often can't deliver. Another pause. Longer this time. Can we meet tomorrow? I was hoping you'd say that. I hung up and checked my watch. 1:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, I'd be sitting in Elizabeth Chen's law office, officially filing the pregnancy discrimination complaint that would transform this personal betrayal into a legal reckoning. By 4 p.m., we'd know if the foundation of Pinnacle's business was as fragile as I suspected. But those were just the opening moves. The real strategy would unfold over months and would require patience, precision, and the ability to turn my forced departure into the competitive advantage they'd never see coming. Amanda Walsh and Jonathan Hayes had no idea that firing me would become the catalyst for losing their biggest clients and their market reputation. They thought they'd eliminated a liability. Instead, they'd created their most dangerous competitor. But they didn't know that yet. In exactly 24 hours, Pinnacle Marketing would receive a federal discrimination complaint that would begin 18 months of legal scrutiny, public relations disasters, and client defections. And I'd be offering those departing clients something Pinnacle could no longer provide: leadership they could trust not to discriminate against employees for starting families. Some revenge plans succeed beyond your imagination. Others teach you that justice and business success aren't mutually exclusive. Elizabeth Chen's law office occupied the corner suite of a converted warehouse downtown, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that somehow managed to look both modern and timeless. When I arrived at 2 p.m., she was waiting with 3 thick folders spread across her conference table and an expression that suggested she was looking forward to our conversation. Natalie, thank you for coming. I've reviewed all the materials you provided, and I have to say, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of pregnancy discrimination I've seen in 15 years of employment law. I wanted to be thorough. Elizabeth opened the first folder, revealing printed emails, recorded conversations, and witness statements I'd been carefully collecting since January. These emails from Amanda Walsh discussing managing the pregnancy situation and minimizing disruption from family leave are particularly damaging. They thought they were being discreet. They thought they were dealing with someone who wouldn't fight back, Elizabeth corrected. But you've been building a case for months, haven't you? I nodded. Since I overheard Amanda telling Jonathan that they needed to transition me out before the maternity leave became a problem. Elizabeth spread out a timeline of discriminatory incidents I documented. The pattern is clear. Exclusion from client meetings after announcing your pregnancy, removal from high-profile projects, comments about divided loyalties and reduced commitment. And today's termination, allegedly for budget reasons, despite your department generating record revenue. What are our chances? Excellent. But I want you to understand what we're undertaking. Federal pregnancy discrimination cases involve extensive discovery, depositions, and potentially years of litigation. Pinnacle will fight this aggressively because they know how much exposure they have. How much exposure? Elizabeth pulled out a legal pad covered with calculations. Based on your salary, documented damages, and the egregious nature of the discrimination, we're looking at potential awards ranging from $500,000 to $1.2 million. And if they settle out of court, companies usually settle pregnancy discrimination cases to avoid public scrutiny and federal investigation. Pinnacle's reputation depends on being seen as a progressive workplace. A public discrimination lawsuit would destroy that image. I thought about the business plan I'd been developing for Summit Strategic Consulting and what $500,000 in startup capital could accomplish. How long until they know we've filed? They'll be served tomorrow morning. You should expect contact from their attorneys within 48 hours. And until then, you're free to operate as you see fit. Start your business. Contact clients. Build your competitive strategy. Just don't violate any non-compete agreements or confidentiality clauses. Elizabeth was right about the non-compete clause, but she didn't know what I knew about how those agreements were structured. Pinnacle's legal department had drafted my non-compete so narrowly that it only prevented me from working for direct competitors in the marketing agency space. It said nothing about starting my own consulting practice or working with former clients who chose to terminate their relationships with Pinnacle. Elizabeth, I need to ask you something confidential. Of course. What happens if several of Pinnacle's major clients decide to terminate their contracts during our litigation? From a legal standpoint, that strengthens our case by demonstrating economic damages to your relationship-based business model. From a practical standpoint, it would put enormous pressure on Pinnacle to settle quickly. And ethically, as long as those clients make their own decisions based on their own business interests, there's nothing unethical about former clients choosing to work with your new consultancy. I signed the legal documents authorizing Elizabeth to file our complaint and walked out of her office feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Control. For the first time since overhearing that conversation in January, I wasn't reacting to Pinnacle's actions. I was driving events according to my own timeline and strategy. My phone rang as I reached the street. Caroline Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Natalie, I've been thinking about our conversation. Can we move our meeting to tonight? I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on our account. Of course. Where would you like to meet? My office, 7 p.m. And Natalie, bring everything you have. I hung up and felt the first stirring of genuine excitement I'd experienced since my pregnancy announcement. By tomorrow evening, I'd know whether Pinnacle's largest client was ready to hear the truth about how their account had been managed and who had really been responsible for their campaign's success. But more importantly, I'd know whether my 3 months of careful planning and documentation had been worth the emotional cost of enduring discrimination in silence while building the case that would hold them accountable. Amanda Walsh thought she'd eliminated a problem employee. Jonathan Hayes thought he'd protected the company from maternity leave disruption. Tomorrow morning, they'd discover that some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate comfort of the people who make them. And I'd be offering their most important clients something Pinnacle could no longer guarantee: leadership that viewed pregnancy and family as normal parts of life, rather than business liabilities to be managed and eliminated. Caroline Morrison's office on the 32nd floor of Titanium Tower offered a commanding view of the city skyline, where the lights were just beginning to twinkle against the darkening October sky. When I arrived at 7 p.m., Caroline was waiting with her CFO, Michael Torres, and her head of marketing, Jessica Park, a signal that this conversation was being taken seriously at the highest levels. "Natalie, thank you for coming on such short notice," Caroline said, gesturing toward the conference table where she'd spread out 2 years' worth of campaign reports. "After our phone conversation, I thought my team should hear what you have to say about our account management." I set my briefcase on the table and pulled out 3 folders containing documentation I'd been carefully preparing for exactly this moment. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. What I'm going to show you isn't about criticizing my former employer. It's about ensuring you understand exactly what services you've been paying for and who's been delivering them." Michael leaned forward. "We're listening." I opened the first folder and spread out performance analytics for Titanium's campaigns over the past 2 years. "These are your campaign metrics since you began working with Pinnacle: revenue attribution, conversion optimization, customer acquisition costs. You've seen these numbers before." "Yes," Jessica said. "Amanda Walsh presents them at our quarterly reviews. Now look at these." I opened the second folder, revealing internal project documents, email chains, and strategic planning materials. These show who actually developed the strategies, managed the client relationships, and executed the optimizations that generated those results. The 3 executives studied the documents carefully. I watched their expressions change as they connected the dots between campaign success and actual responsibility. "According to these internal records," Michael said slowly, "you were the primary strategist and account manager for 98% of our campaigns over the past 18 months. Correct. But Amanda has been presenting herself as the strategic mind behind our account. Also correct." Caroline sat back in her chair. "So Amanda has been taking credit for work you did?" "Amanda has been taking credit for work she couldn't do, and here's what should concern you most." I opened the third folder, revealing competitive analysis and performance projections. These show what your campaigns should have been generating based on industry benchmarks and your market position. You've been paying for premium strategic services, but your results suggest you've been getting standard execution. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked. "I mean that while I was developing your campaigns, I was also managing 6 other major accounts. None of you were getting the focused attention you deserved because Pinnacle prioritized quantity over quality. And you think you can do better independently? I know I can do better. Because when I'm not stretched across 7 accounts while someone else takes credit for my work, I can focus on maximizing results for 3 or 4 clients who receive my complete attention." Michael was studying the performance projections. "These numbers suggest we could improve ROI by 30 to 40% with more focused management. Conservative estimate. I think we can do significantly better." Caroline stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Natalie, I have to ask you directly. Are you trying to steal our account from Pinnacle?" "No, Caroline. I'm trying to prevent you from continuing to pay for services you're not receiving while working with people who take credit for work they don't do. What's the difference?" "The difference is that I'm offering to provide the same level of service you thought you were getting from Pinnacle, but with complete transparency about who's doing the work and accountability for the results." I pulled out a service proposal I drafted specifically for Titanium Industries. This contract includes performance guarantees, direct access to the person managing your campaigns, and a fee structure that's 25% lower than what you're currently paying Pinnacle. 25% lower? Michael asked. "My overhead is minimal, my focus is complete, and I don't need to generate margins to support people who aren't contributing to your success." Jessica had been quiet throughout most of the presentation, but now she spoke up. "Natalie, this is impressive work, but you're asking us to risk our marketing budget on a 1-person consultancy with no track record? I'm asking you to work with the same person who's been delivering your results for 2 years. The only thing changing is the name on the invoices and the guarantee that you'll receive the attention you're paying for." Caroline turned back toward the table. "When could you start?" "Monday." "Monday? Don't you need time to set up operations, establish systems, handle administrative requirements?" I smiled. "Caroline, I've been preparing for this conversation for 3 months. My operations are already established, my systems are already tested, and my administrative infrastructure is already functional." Michael looked surprised. "You've been planning to leave Pinnacle for 3 months?" I've been planning to leave Pinnacle since I realized that announcing my pregnancy had made me a liability rather than an asset to their business model. You think they fired you because you're pregnant? I know they fired me because I'm pregnant. And I have documented evidence that their decision had nothing to do with budget constraints and everything to do with avoiding maternity leave and family accommodation. Caroline, Michael, and Jessica exchanged glances in the way executives communicate when they're processing information that could affect major business decisions. Natalie, Caroline said finally, we'd like to engage Summit Strategic Consulting as our primary marketing partner, effective Monday. I was hoping you'd say that. As I packed up my presentation materials, I felt the satisfaction of the first major victory in what would be a carefully orchestrated campaign. But this was just the beginning. By Monday morning, Pinnacle would discover that their largest client had terminated their contract. By the end of the week, they'd receive a federal discrimination complaint that would begin months of legal scrutiny and reputation management. And I'd be building a business with the settlement money from their own illegal behavior, while providing their former clients with the kind of service Pinnacle could no longer guarantee. Some revenge plans succeed through destruction. Others succeed through demonstrating that you can do everything they claim to do, but better. The next morning brought the phone call I'd been expecting since filing the discrimination complaint 24 hours earlier. At 8:17 a.m., while I was reviewing startup documents for Summit Strategic Consulting, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Natalie Williams speaking. Miss Williams, this is Patricia Blackwood from Morrison, Crawford, and Amp Associates. We represent Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. I understand you filed a complaint with the EEOC regarding your recent termination. Patricia Blackwood was exactly what I'd expected, senior partner at the city's most expensive employment defense firm, brought in to handle high-stakes discrimination cases that could cost companies millions in damages and reputation recovery. That's correct. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your concerns and explore potential resolutions that might address your situation more efficiently than extended litigation. You mean you'd like to offer me a settlement before this becomes public and damages Pinnacle's reputation? There was a brief pause. Miss Williams, I think we can find a solution that benefits everyone involved. When would be convenient for you? I'm available this afternoon. 2 p.m. Excellent. Our offices are, actually. Let's meet at Elizabeth Chen's office. I assume you know where that is. Of course. We'll see you at 2. I hung up and immediately called Elizabeth to update her on Pinnacle's rapid response to our complaint. They're moving fast, Elizabeth said. That suggests they're very concerned about exposure. What did Patricia Blackwood sound like? Professional, controlled, and ready to negotiate. Good. That means they've reviewed your documentation and understand they're in a weak position. But Natalie, I want you to prepare yourself for what's coming. They're going to offer you enough money to make litigation seem unnecessary while requiring confidentiality agreements that prevent you from discussing the discrimination. How much money? Based on their response time and choice of counsel, probably $400,000 to $600,000. Enough to be tempting, not enough to acknowledge the full scope of their liability. And if we refuse? Then we proceed with litigation, which takes 18 months and involves depositions, discovery, and public scrutiny that will cost them far more than money. I thought about my business plan and what $600,000 in startup capital could accomplish, balanced against the satisfaction of exposing Pinnacle's discriminatory practices through public litigation. Elizabeth, what happens if more of their clients terminate contracts during settlement negotiations? It strengthens our position by demonstrating the business relationships they destroyed through illegal termination. Why? Because I have meetings scheduled with 3 more major clients this week, and I suspect they'll be interested in hearing about alternative service arrangements. As long as those clients make independent business decisions based on their own interests, their choices actually support our discrimination case. The meeting at Elizabeth's office that afternoon included Patricia Blackwood, Pinnacle's general counsel Kevin Walsh, Amanda's husband, which explained much about the family-friendly rhetoric versus reality at Pinnacle, and a younger associate whose job seemed to be taking notes and looking intimidated. Miss Williams, Patricia began, we've reviewed your complaint, and while we believe Pinnacle's employment decisions were entirely legitimate, we're prepared to offer a settlement that recognizes the unfortunate appearance of timing in your termination. What kind of settlement? Kevin leaned forward. $500,000, continuation of health benefits through your pregnancy and 6 months postpartum, and a positive reference letter for your consulting practice. In exchange for a confidentiality agreement regarding your employment experience and a mutual non-disparagement clause. Elizabeth and I had anticipated this exact offer. The money was significant but not punitive, designed to make litigation seem costly and unnecessary. The confidentiality clause would prevent me from discussing their discriminatory practices, protecting their reputation while silencing their victim. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I have some concerns about the terms. Patricia raised an eyebrow. What concerns? The confidentiality clause would prevent me from responding honestly to potential clients who ask why I left Pinnacle. Since my consulting business depends on relationship-based credibility, that seems like an unreasonable restriction. We could modify the confidentiality language to allow factual statements about your departure without editorial commentary. And the non-disparagement clause? We could make that mutual, so neither party makes negative statements about the other. I looked at Elizabeth, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. I need 48 hours to consider your revised offer, I said. Of course, but Miss Williams, I want you to understand that this offer reflects Pinnacle's desire to resolve this matter amicably. If you choose litigation, we'll defend our employment decisions vigorously. I understand. And Patricia, I want you to understand that my decision won't be based on fear of litigation. It'll be based on what provides the best outcome for my family and my business. As we left Elizabeth's office, she pulled me aside. They're scared, she said. $500,000 in the first offer means they think their exposure is much higher. If you're building a successful consulting practice, you might want to consider taking their money and using it to compete against them, rather than exposing them through public litigation. Sometimes the best revenge is using their own money to build something better than what they tried to destroy. That evening, I had dinner with Marcus Flynn, who'd called that morning to discuss his growing frustration with Pinnacle's treatment of employees who prioritized family commitments. 3 more people have given notice since your termination, he said. Good people who've decided they can't trust a company that fires someone for getting pregnant. Where are they going? 2 are joining competing agencies. 1 is starting her own practice. Marcus paused. Actually, I've been thinking about your consulting business. Are you planning to hire employees? Eventually. Why? Because you're going to need account managers who understand relationship-based client service and aren't afraid of companies that discriminate against working parents. I studied Marcus's expression. He'd been one of Pinnacle's most reliable performers for 4 years, but I could see the frustration and disillusionment that had been building since my termination. Marcus, are you suggesting you'd be interested in joining Summit Strategic? I'm suggesting that some of us learned something important from watching how they treated you. And maybe it's time to work somewhere that views pregnancy and family as normal parts of life, rather than business problems to be eliminated. By the time I got home that night, I had a decision to make about Pinnacle's settlement offer, and a growing sense that my revenge plan was evolving beyond individual justice towards something much more significant. The question was whether $500,000 and a confidentiality agreement was worth more than the public accountability that full litigation would provide. But I was beginning to understand that the most satisfying revenge might be using Pinnacle's money to build a company that succeeded by doing exactly what they claimed to do, but without the discrimination and employee exploitation. Friday morning brought the news that would fundamentally change my negotiating position with Pinnacle. At 9:23 a.m., while I was reviewing financial projections for Summit Strategic, my phone rang with a call from Thomas Bradford, CEO of Meridian Financial Services. Natalie, I hope I'm not calling too early. I got your number from Caroline Morrison, who had some very interesting things to say about your new consulting practice. Thomas Bradford represented exactly what I'd been hoping for, a CEO who valued relationships and results over agency politics and credit-taking. Meridian was Pinnacle's second-largest client, with annual billings of nearly $800,000. Not too early at all, Thomas. What can I do for you? Caroline mentioned that you'd been managing the strategic side of our account at Pinnacle for the past 18 months. Is that accurate? I was the primary strategist and relationship manager for your account, yes, and she said you could demonstrate significant performance improvements if we worked with you directly, rather than through Pinnacle. I can provide detailed analysis showing how focused attention to your account could improve results by 30 to 40% over current performance. When could we meet to discuss that analysis? Monday morning. If that works for your schedule, perfect. 10 a.m. at our offices. And Natalie, bring everything you have. After I hung up, I called Elizabeth to update her on the rapidly evolving client situation. 2 major clients in 3 days, she said. That's going to put enormous pressure on Pinnacle to settle quickly and generously. How much pressure? Titanium and Meridian represent almost $1.4 million in annual billings. Losing both of them would cost Pinnacle more than paying us $1 million settlement. So they'll increase their offer? They'll increase their offer, and they'll probably agree to remove or significantly modify the confidentiality requirements. Companies don't pay premium settlements to protect reputations that are being destroyed anyway. That afternoon, I received a call that confirmed my suspicions about how quickly word was spreading through Pinnacle's client base. Miss Williams? This is Diana Foster from Quantum Technologies. I understand you've started an independent consulting practice. Diana Foster was the CMO of a mid-sized tech company that had been working with Pinnacle for 3 years. More importantly, she was someone I'd built a personal relationship with through strategic planning sessions and campaign development. That's correct. As of this week, I'm operating Summit Strategic Consulting. I'll be direct with you. We've been increasingly dissatisfied with the level of attention our account receives at Pinnacle. When we heard you were available independently, several of us thought we should explore alternative arrangements. I'd be happy to discuss how independent consulting might better serve your specific needs. Can you meet next Thursday? I'd like you to present to our executive team. Absolutely. By the end of the week, I'd scheduled meetings with 4 of Pinnacle's significant clients, each representing between $300,000 and $800,000 in annual billings. More importantly, I'd established a pattern that would make Pinnacle's discriminatory behavior extremely expensive in terms of lost business and reputation damage. Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting since Patricia Blackwood realized that her client's problems extended far beyond employment litigation. Miss Williams, I'd like to schedule another meeting to discuss revised settlement terms. What kind of revisions are you considering? We're prepared to increase our offer to $750,000 and eliminate the confidentiality restrictions in exchange for a reasonable timeline for resolution. How reasonable? We'd like to finalize settlement within 2 weeks. The urgency in her voice confirmed what I'd suspected. Pinnacle was facing immediate client defections that made resolving the discrimination complaint their top priority. I'll need to discuss this with my attorney and get back to you within 48 hours. Of course. But Miss Williams, I want you to understand that this represents Pinnacle's best offer. If these terms aren't acceptable, we'll have to proceed with litigation defense rather than settlement negotiations. I hung up and immediately called Elizabeth. $750,000 and no confidentiality clause, she said. That's better than we would have gotten through litigation, and you get the money 18 months sooner. What's the downside? The downside is that they don't admit wrongdoing, and they don't face the public accountability that a trial would provide, but they do face the business consequences of losing major clients to my consulting practice. Exactly. Sometimes market consequences are more effective than legal consequences. That evening, I had dinner with Marcus and 2 other former Pinnacle employees who'd given their notice during the week following my termination. The conversation convinced me that individual justice through settlement might be less important than the systemic change that was already happening. What you did, said Alex Park, a former account manager, was show everyone that they'd rather lose good employees than accommodate normal life events like pregnancy and family. And what they're discovering, added Marcus, is that losing those employees costs more than accommodating them would have. How so? Client relationships, institutional knowledge, performance, consistency, all the things that agencies sell but can't deliver when they treat employees as interchangeable resources. Plus, Alex continued, everyone remaining at Pinnacle now knows that loyalty and performance don't protect you from discrimination. That's not exactly inspiring workplace culture. As I drove home, I reflected on how my revenge plan had evolved beyond personal satisfaction towards something more significant. I'd started by wanting to hold Pinnacle accountable for firing me illegally. But what was emerging was a demonstration that companies couldn't build sustainable businesses on discriminatory employment practices. The question wasn't whether to accept Pinnacle's settlement offer. The question was whether $750,000 in startup capital would be more valuable than 18 months of public litigation that might produce similar financial results with greater personal cost. By tomorrow evening, I'd know whether my 3 months of documentation and strategic planning had been sufficient to build both a successful business and appropriate accountability for the people who'd tried to destroy my career for having a baby. But I already knew that some victories were measured not just in money received, but in systems changed and precedents established for other women who might face similar discrimination. The settlement conference Tuesday morning took place in the same conference room where Patricia Blackwood had first offered me money to stay quiet about Pinnacle's discrimination. This time, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. Patricia arrived with Kevin Walsh and 2 additional associates, suggesting they were taking this negotiation much more seriously than our first meeting. "Miss Williams," Patricia began, "we've prepared a comprehensive settlement agreement that addresses the concerns you raised in our previous discussion." Elizabeth reviewed the document quickly, noting the key changes from their original offer. $750,000. Immediate payment. Health benefits continuation through 6 months postpartum. And no confidentiality or non-disparagement restrictions. "In exchange for?" I asked. "A standard release of claims related to your employment and termination, and an agreement not to encourage Pinnacle employees to violate their existing employment contracts. The second clause seems unnecessary unless you're concerned about employee departures." Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "We're simply protecting our legitimate business interests while providing you with generous compensation for any inconvenience you may have experienced." Kevin leaned forward. "Miss Williams, I want to emphasize that this settlement reflects Pinnacle's desire to resolve this matter efficiently, not any admission of wrongdoing in your termination. I understand, and I want you to understand, that my decision is based on what provides the best foundation for my family's future and my business success." Elizabeth had prepared me for this moment. The settlement offer was substantial enough to fund Summit Strategic's growth for 2 years, while eliminating the uncertainty and emotional cost of extended litigation. More importantly, the absence of confidentiality restrictions meant I could compete freely against Pinnacle without legal constraints. "I'll accept your terms," I said, "with one modification." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "What modification?" "I want the settlement structured as an investment in my consulting practice rather than personal damages. That provides tax advantages and establishes a legal foundation for my competitive activities. That's unusual, but not unreasonable, given that you're essentially capitalizing the business. I'm starting because your discrimination made it impossible to continue my career at Pinnacle." Elizabeth smiled. She'd suggested this approach specifically because it positioned the settlement as business investment rather than personal injury, providing both tax benefits and symbolic victory. "We can structure the payment that way," Patricia agreed. The settlement documents were finalized within 2 hours. By 1 p.m., I'd officially received $750,000 from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions to fund Summit Strategic Consulting, with no restrictions on how I competed against them or what I said about my termination. As I walked out of the conference room for the last time, Kevin Walsh pulled me aside. "Natalie, I hope you understand that this settlement reflects our respect for your contributions and our desire to see you succeed in your new venture. Kevin, I hope you understand that this settlement reflects the cost of discriminating against employees for starting families, and that other companies will learn from your experience." The irony wasn't lost on me that Pinnacle had just funded their own competition while trying to eliminate what they saw as a business liability. That afternoon, I officially incorporated Summit Strategic Consulting and used Pinnacle's settlement money to lease office space in the same building where Caroline Morrison and Thomas Bradford had their offices. The location was strategic, convenient for my current clients, and symbolically significant as the place where I'd rebuild what Pinnacle had tried to destroy. My phone rang as I was reviewing equipment and furniture purchases. Marcus Flynn's name appeared on the screen. "Natalie, I have news that I think you'll find interesting." "What news?" "Amanda Walsh submitted her resignation yesterday afternoon." "Really? Did she say why?" "Officially, she's pursuing new opportunities." Unofficially, Jonathan Hayes apparently decided that the head of HR, who created a 7-figure discrimination settlement, was a liability rather than an asset. Poetic irony. Gets better. "They've asked me to help with the transition and client communication around your departure and the recent account losses." "How are they explaining the client departures?" "That's where it gets interesting. They can't acknowledge that clients are following you without admitting that your termination was a mistake. But they can't explain the departures without acknowledging that client relationships were tied to individual employees rather than agency capabilities. So they're caught between admitting they were wrong to fire me or admitting their business model was fundamentally flawed. Exactly, and either admission damages their reputation with remaining clients. That evening, I had the first team meeting for Summit Strategic Consulting. Marcus had officially accepted my offer to join as Director of Client Services, bringing with him detailed knowledge of Pinnacle's operational weaknesses and relationships with several clients who were questioning their agency partnerships. "What's our client pipeline looking like?" Marcus asked, reviewing the business plan I developed over the past week. Confirmed. Titanium Industries and Meridian Financial, representing $1.2 million in annual billings. Pending Quantum Technologies and 2 smaller accounts from Pinnacle, representing another $600,000. And Perspective? 3 companies that aren't currently working with Pinnacle but have heard about our approach through referrals. If we land half of those, we'll be at $2.3 million in annual revenue by the end of our first year. That's larger than most mid-size agencies. That's the point. We're not trying to be a small consulting practice. We're trying to demonstrate that relationship-based business development and family-friendly employment practices can create more sustainable success than the models most agencies use. Marcus studied our financial projections. This is really about more than revenge against Pinnacle, isn't it? It started as revenge, but it's evolved into something more important, proving that companies can't build lasting success on employment discrimination and taking credit for other people's work. And if we succeed, we'll have used Pinnacle's own money to create a model that other agencies will have to adopt or lose clients to companies that treat employees and relationships more intelligently. As I prepared for our first client meetings as an independent consultancy, I realized that my pregnancy discrimination case had become something I'd never expected, a business plan funded by the people who discriminated against me, designed to compete directly against their model while demonstrating that family and business success weren't mutually exclusive. Amanda Walsh had fired me to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd created the catalyst for her own career destruction and her company's competitive disadvantage. Some revenge plans succeed through destruction. Others succeed through construction that makes the original aggressor irrelevant. 3 weeks after the settlement, Summit Strategic Consulting officially opened for business in a suite of offices that offered something Pinnacle had never provided: a lactation room, flexible work arrangements, and explicit policies supporting employees who chose to start families. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd used their discrimination settlement to create exactly the kind of workplace they'd refused to be. Our first major presentation was to Quantum Technologies, where Diana Foster had assembled her entire executive team to evaluate our proposal for managing their digital marketing strategy. Marcus and I had spent a week developing a comprehensive analysis showing how focused attention could improve their campaign performance by 40% over their current Pinnacle results. "Before we begin," Diana said, "I want to acknowledge that this decision isn't just about marketing performance. It's about working with a consultancy that demonstrates the kind of values we want to support." The presentation went exactly as I'd hoped. Within an hour, we demonstrated clear competitive advantages, lower costs, higher performance projections, and personalized attention that large agencies couldn't provide. More importantly, we'd established credibility as a consultancy that could deliver results while maintaining the professional integrity Pinnacle had compromised. "When could you begin managing our accounts?" asked Quantum CEO, Peter Chen. "Monday," I replied. "We've been preparing for this transition for weeks." "Monday? That seems very fast." "Diana, we've been analyzing your account performance and strategic opportunities since our first conversation. My systems are already configured, my processes are already tested, and my approach is already focused on your specific business objectives." Peter looked surprised. "You've been preparing to manage our account for 3 weeks?" "I've been preparing to do for you what I was already doing at Pinnacle, but with complete focus and transparency about who's responsible for your results." The Quantum contract was signed that afternoon, representing $600,000 in annual billings, and our third major client victory in less than a month. More importantly, it established a pattern that would force Pinnacle to confront the relationship between their discriminatory practices and their business losses. But the real turning point came when I received an unexpected call from someone I'd never spoken with directly. "Miss Williams, this is Jonathan Hayes from Pinnacle Marketing." I was hoping we could meet to discuss a potential collaboration between our companies. Jonathan Hayes calling me personally was something I'd never anticipated. As CEO, he'd maintained distance from the discrimination situation, letting Amanda and the legal team handle what he probably viewed as an HR problem that had gotten out of hand. What kind of collaboration did you have in mind? I think there might be opportunities for Pinnacle and Summit Strategic to work together on larger projects that require more resources than either company can provide independently. The proposal was transparently desperate. Pinnacle was facing continued client losses and reputation damage, and Jonathan was apparently hoping that associating with my consultancy might restore some credibility to his company's brand. Jonathan, that's an interesting proposal, but I'm not sure how collaboration would work given the circumstances of my departure. I want you to know that I deeply regret how your termination was handled. Amanda made decisions that didn't reflect the values I want Pinnacle to represent. You mean the values Amanda implemented with your knowledge and approval? There was a long silence. Miss Williams, I'm calling because I recognize that Pinnacle made serious mistakes, and I'd like to find a way to make this situation right for everyone involved. Jonathan, you already made this situation right by funding my consultancy through your discrimination settlement. But I appreciate the acknowledgement. Would you be willing to meet anyway? I think there are things we should discuss. Such as the fact that we're both committed to this industry and both interested in sustainable business practices that actually serve clients rather than just generating revenue. I agreed to meet with Jonathan, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to understand how Pinnacle's leadership was processing their losses and reputation damage. The meeting took place the following week in a neutral conference room at the downtown business center. Jonathan arrived alone, without attorneys or HR representatives, which suggested he wanted to have an honest conversation rather than a defensive negotiation. Natalie, I want to start by apologizing for what you experienced at Pinnacle. The discrimination you faced was unacceptable, and it ended your employment in a way that violated both legal standards and basic human decency. I appreciate that acknowledgement. I also want you to know that we've made significant changes to our employment policies and leadership structure to ensure this kind of discrimination doesn't happen again. What kind of changes? Amanda Walsh is no longer with the company. We've hired a new HR director who specializes in family-friendly workplace policies, and we've implemented training programs to address unconscious bias in management decisions. Those are positive steps. Natalie, I also want to discuss something that might seem unusual. Several of our remaining clients have asked whether there's any possibility of working with you on their accounts while maintaining their relationship with Pinnacle. What do you mean? I mean that your reputation for relationship management and strategic thinking has created demand that extends beyond the clients who've already moved to your consultancy. Some companies want access to your capabilities without changing their primary agency relationship. I studied Jonathan's expression. He was essentially proposing that Pinnacle subcontract work to the consultancy I'd built with their discrimination settlement money. Jonathan, are you suggesting that Pinnacle would hire Summit Strategic as a strategic partner? I'm suggesting that there might be arrangements that benefit everyone involved, your consultancy, our remaining clients, and Pinnacle's long-term reputation recovery. And what would Pinnacle gain from such an arrangement? Association with a consultancy that represents the kind of values and practices our clients want to support. Credibility through partnership with someone who's demonstrated superior results. The conversation continued for an hour, during which Jonathan outlined a partnership proposal that would essentially position Summit Strategic as Pinnacle's strategic consulting division while maintaining our independence and client relationships. As I drove back to my office, I realized that Jonathan's proposal represented something I'd never expected. Pinnacle acknowledging that discriminating against me had been not just illegal and immoral, but strategically catastrophic. But I also realized that some victories are more satisfying when they're complete, rather than compromised through partnerships that dilute the consequences of discriminatory behavior. The question was whether collaborating with Pinnacle would accelerate my business growth or compromise the principles that had motivated my entire response to their discrimination. The partnership proposal from Jonathan Hayes created a decision I hadn't anticipated when I'd started planning my response to Pinnacle's discrimination. That evening, I discussed the implications with Marcus over dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, where the city lights reflected off the water like scattered stars. "It's a remarkable offer," Marcus said, reviewing the partnership terms Jonathan had outlined. Essentially, they'd be paying us to rehabilitate their reputation while providing services they can no longer deliver independently. What's your instinct about their motivations? Desperation, disguised as strategic thinking. They've lost 4 major clients in 6 weeks. Their HR director has resigned under pressure, and their remaining clients are questioning their commitment to the values they claim to represent. And if we accept their partnership proposal, we'd have immediate access to larger projects and higher revenue, but we'd also be providing Pinnacle with credibility they haven't earned through their own behavioral changes. I thought about the pregnant women who might work at Pinnacle in the future and whether partnership with Summit Strategic would protect them from the kind of discrimination I'd experienced or simply provide cover for continued problematic practices. Marcus, what do you think would send a stronger message about the consequences of employment discrimination partnering with them or continuing to compete against them independently? Competing against them? Partnership suggests that discrimination can be resolved through business arrangements rather than requiring genuine accountability. That's my instinct too. The next morning, I called Jonathan to decline his partnership proposal and explain my reasoning. Jonathan, I appreciate the offer and the acknowledgement of mistakes, but I don't think partnership serves either of our long-term interests. Can I ask why? Because my consultancy succeeds by demonstrating that family-friendly employment practices and ethical business development create better results than the approaches that led to my discrimination. Partnership with Pinnacle would undermine that demonstration. So you'd rather compete against us than work with us? I'd rather prove that companies can't discriminate against employees for starting families and expect to maintain competitive advantage in the marketplace. There was a long pause. I understand your position, Natalie, and frankly, I respect it. Thank you. But I want you to know that this creates a situation where our companies will be competing directly for the same clients and market opportunities. Jonathan, we've been competing directly since the day you allowed Amanda to fire me for being pregnant. The only difference is that now you understand what you're competing against. The conversation ended cordially, but with clear recognition that Pinnacle and Summit Strategic would be operating as direct competitors rather than potential partners. That afternoon brought news that confirmed my decision to maintain competitive independence. Tyler Kim, a former Pinnacle account director who'd been quietly job searching since my termination, called with information about internal developments at my former company. Natalie, I wanted you to know that Pinnacle lost another major client yesterday. Meridian Insurance terminated their contract, citing concerns about account management consistency. What kind of concerns? According to my contacts, they couldn't get clear answers about who would be managing their account now that Amanda was gone and you'd left the company. So they were specifically asking about my involvement? More than that, they were asking whether Pinnacle could guarantee the same level of strategic thinking and relationship management they'd received while you were there. And Pinnacle's response? They couldn't provide that guarantee without admitting that their results had been dependent on individual employees rather than company capabilities. Tyler's call revealed the deeper problem Pinnacle faced in trying to recover from my departure. They couldn't acknowledge the relationship between my termination and their client losses without admitting that their employment decisions had been based on discrimination rather than business necessity. Tyler, are you planning to stay at Pinnacle? Actually, I've been thinking about your consultancy. Are you hiring additional strategists? We're growing faster than anticipated. Are you interested in joining Summit Strategic? I'm interested in working somewhere that doesn't fire people for normal life events like starting families. Tyler's decision to leave Pinnacle represented something I hadn't anticipated. Talented employees choosing to work for Summit Strategic not just for better compensation or working conditions, but because they wanted to be associated with a company that had successfully challenged discrimination and built a better alternative. By the end of the month, we'd hired 3 former Pinnacle employees, secured 6 major clients, and established a waiting list of companies interested in working with our consultancy. More importantly, we demonstrated that ethical employment practices and relationship-based business development could generate sustainable competitive advantage. The local business journal called that week, requesting an interview about Summit Strategic's rapid growth and impact on the regional marketing industry. "We're interested in the story behind your success," said reporter Angela Foster. How does a consultancy founded by someone who was fired for pregnancy discrimination become the fastest-growing marketing firm in the region within 4 months? By demonstrating that companies succeed when they treat employees fairly and focus on actual results rather than taking credit for other people's work. And you think that model is sustainable? I think it's the only sustainable model in an industry where relationships and trust are the foundation of business success. What about companies like Pinnacle that built their business on different approaches? Companies that discriminate against employees and take credit for work they don't do will eventually lose talent and clients to competitors who operate more ethically. Is this about revenge against your former employer? This started as a response to illegal discrimination, but it's evolved into something more important, proving that business success and ethical employment practices aren't mutually exclusive. The article, published 2 weeks later, positioned Summit Strategic as an example of how workplace discrimination could backfire when talented employees had the resources and determination to build competitive alternatives. But the real vindication came when I received a call from Caroline Morrison at Titanium Industries. Natalie, I wanted you to know that our board is so impressed with Summit Strategic's performance that we're recommending your consultancy to other companies in our industry network. That's wonderful to hear. More than that, we want to invest in your company's growth. We think your model represents the future of client services, and we want to support that development. What kind of investment? Enough to fund your expansion into other markets and establish Summit Strategic as a regional leader in ethical business practices and superior client service. As I hung up, I realized that my revenge plan had evolved far beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. Instead of simply holding Pinnacle accountable for their discrimination, I'd accidentally created a business model that other companies wanted to support and emulate. Amanda Walsh had fired me to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of her industry's most significant competitive threat and her own career destruction. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't Pinnacle's losses or my business success. It was the realization that other pregnant women in similar situations now had a precedent and a resource for responding to employment discrimination. 6 months after my termination, Summit Strategic Consulting had grown to 15 employees, occupied a full floor of office space, and generated over $3 million in annual revenue. The waiting room featured a wall of client testimonials and a small play area for employees' children, a pointed contrast to the sterile, family-unfriendly environment at Pinnacle Marketing. The morning brought news that I'd been both expecting and dreading. Marcus walked into my office with a copy of the business section from the local newspaper, folded to reveal a headline that made my stomach tighten with complex emotions. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions files for bankruptcy protection. The headline read, with a subheading that added, Regional Agency cites client losses and reputation damage in Chapter 11 filing. I read the article carefully, noting the carefully worded statements from Jonathan Hayes about market pressures, competitive challenges, and strategic restructuring. Nowhere did the article mention pregnancy discrimination, employment lawsuits, or the specific client defections that had precipitated their financial collapse. How do you feel about this? Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Complicated, I admitted. I wanted them to face consequences for discriminating against me, but I didn't necessarily want to see the entire company destroyed. You didn't destroy the company, Natalie. They destroyed themselves by choosing discrimination over accommodation and credit-taking over actual performance. But if I hadn't left and taken clients with me, if you hadn't left, you would have eventually been forced out anyway, just with less documentation and fewer resources to respond. Their business model was unsustainable, regardless of your individual situation. Marcus was right about the broader trajectory, but the reality of Pinnacle's collapse still felt heavier than I'd anticipated. 43 employees would lose their jobs, not all of whom had been involved in or supportive of the discrimination that had triggered their company's downfall. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection on Pinnacle's bankruptcy. Elizabeth Chen's name appeared on the screen. Natalie, I assume you've seen the news about Pinnacle. Just read about it this morning. I wanted you to know that their bankruptcy filing includes specific reference to employment litigation costs and reputation damage as contributing factors to their financial problems. What does that mean practically? It means they've officially acknowledged that discriminating against you had business consequences that extended far beyond the settlement payment. That's important precedent for other employment discrimination cases. And for Pinnacle? Their bankruptcy will probably result in acquisition by a larger agency or liquidation of assets. Either way, the Pinnacle brand and leadership structure that created your discrimination situation is essentially finished. After Elizabeth hung up, I sat quietly in my office, processing the finality of what had happened. The company where I'd spent 5 years building my career and developing client relationships had ceased to exist as an independent entity, largely because of consequences that flowed from their decision to fire me for being pregnant. But the complexity of my feelings was interrupted by a knock on my office door. Diana Foster from Quantum Technologies was waiting in the reception area with news that would reshape how I understood Summit Strategic's role in the industry transformation we'd accidentally initiated. Natalie, I wanted to discuss something with you personally rather than over the phone. Of course, what's on your mind? The Regional Business Association is planning their annual conference for next spring, and they want you to deliver the keynote address about ethical employment practices and competitive business strategy. What's the topic they have in mind? How companies that prioritize family-friendly policies and authentic relationship management can achieve sustainable competitive advantage over organizations that rely on discrimination and credit appropriation. The invitation was both flattering and symbolically significant. A year ago, I'd been fired for pregnancy discrimination. Now I was being asked to address the regional business community about the competitive advantages of ethical employment practices. Diana, I'm honored, but I want to make sure the speech focuses on positive business models rather than just criticism of companies like Pinnacle. Actually, that's exactly what they want. They're interested in showcasing Summit Strategic as an example of how workplace discrimination can backfire when talented employees have the resources to build competitive alternatives. And they want me to use Pinnacle as a cautionary tale? They want you to use your entire experience as a case study in how ethical business practices create sustainable success, while discriminatory practices create competitive vulnerabilities. As Diana and I discussed the keynote opportunity, I realized that my story had become something larger than individual revenge or business success. It had become a demonstration of how markets could correct discriminatory behavior when victims had the knowledge and resources to create competitive responses. That afternoon, I received a call from Tyler Kim, who had news about the aftermath of Pinnacle's bankruptcy filing. Natalie, Jonathan Hayes called me yesterday. He wanted to know if Summit Strategic might be interested in acquiring some of Pinnacle's client contracts and operational assets. He wants us to buy pieces of his company. More than that, he's essentially offering to sell us everything that made Pinnacle valuable: client relationships, strategic processes, and industry reputation, while acknowledging that Summit Strategic has become the regional leader in ethical marketing services. What did you tell him? I told him I'd discuss it with you, but that I suspected we weren't interested in acquiring assets from a company that had demonstrated such poor judgment about employment law and business ethics. Tyler's conversation with Jonathan represented the final irony in my revenge plan. The company that had fired me for pregnancy discrimination was now hoping to sell itself to the consultancy I'd built with their settlement money. But more than irony, it represented validation of the approach we'd taken. Instead of simply accepting discrimination or limiting our response to legal action, we'd built a competitive alternative that had become successful enough to acquire our former oppressor. Tyler, what's your recommendation about Jonathan's offer? Decline it. We've succeeded by doing everything they claim to do, but better. Acquiring their assets would suggest we needed something they had, rather than demonstrating that we'd built something superior. I agree, but I want to meet with Jonathan one more time. Why? Because I want to understand how he's processing the connection between his company's discriminatory practices and their ultimate failure. And I want to make sure other business leaders understand that connection too. As I prepared for what would likely be my final conversation with Pinnacle's leadership, I reflected on how completely my situation had been transformed. 6 months ago, I'd been fired for pregnancy discrimination. Today, I was being asked to acquire the company that had discriminated against me and to speak to the business community about ethical competitive advantage. Amanda Walsh had tried to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of the most successful marketing consultancy in the region and established a precedent that would protect other women from similar discrimination. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't Pinnacle's destruction or Summit Strategic's success. It was the knowledge that my response to discrimination had created sustainable change that extended far beyond my individual situation. The final meeting with Jonathan Hayes took place in the conference room of his bankruptcy attorney's office, where the remnants of Pinnacle marketing were being prepared for liquidation or acquisition. When I arrived, Jonathan was waiting alone with financial documents and asset inventories spread across the table like evidence of corporate failure. "Natalie, thank you for coming. I know this situation must feel unusual for you. It feels like the logical conclusion of decisions your company made 6 months ago." Jonathan gestured toward the financial documents. "I want you to see these numbers because I think they tell a story that's important for both of us to understand." He opened a folder containing detailed analysis of Pinnacle's client losses, revenue decline, and employee departures since my termination. The numbers were stark. 7 major clients representing $2.8 million in annual billings, 12 employees including 3 senior strategists, and reputation damage that had prevented them from winning new business. "According to our analysis," Jonathan continued, 86% of our client losses were directly related to relationships and account management that you had developed. And the other 14%? Companies that left because they didn't want to be associated with an agency that discriminated against employees for starting families. Jonathan's admission was more complete than I'd expected. He was acknowledging not just the business consequences of my departure, but the reputational damage caused by their discriminatory practices. "Jonathan, why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that your termination wasn't just illegal and immoral, it was the single worst business decision in Pinnacle's 15-year history. And you want me to acquire the company that made that decision? I want you to consider whether there's value in the assets and relationships that weren't directly tied to the discrimination you experienced." I studied the asset inventory he'd prepared. Beyond client contracts and office equipment, Pinnacle had developed some genuinely valuable intellectual property. Strategic frameworks, campaign templates, and industry analysis tools that could potentially accelerate Summit Strategic's growth. What would you want in exchange for these assets? Enough to pay off outstanding debts and provide severance for the employees who'll lose their jobs when we liquidate. How much money? $400,000 for complete acquisition of remaining assets, including client contracts, intellectual property, and operational systems. The amount was reasonable, less than half of the discrimination settlement they'd paid me, and it would essentially eliminate any remaining competition while providing resources for Summit Strategic's continued expansion. "Jonathan, I need to ask you something directly. Do you understand the connection between Amanda's decision to fire me and Pinnacle's bankruptcy? I understand that discriminating against you started a chain of events that ultimately destroyed our business. And do you understand why I built Summit Strategic instead of just taking the settlement money and moving on? Because you wanted to prove that ethical business practices could generate better results than the approaches that led to your discrimination." "Exactly. So what happens if I acquire Pinnacle's assets? Does that send the message that discrimination has consequences, or does it suggest that those consequences can be resolved through business transactions?" Jonathan was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of my question. "Natalie, I think acquiring our assets sends the message that ethical business practices succeed so completely that they can absorb and repurpose the remnants of unethical competitors." "That's an interesting perspective. But more than that, I think it demonstrates that your approach wasn't just about revenge against Pinnacle. It was about building something better than what we'd created." I left the meeting with Jonathan's asset purchase agreement and a commitment to provide an answer within 48 hours. That evening, I discussed the decision with Marcus and the senior team at Summit Strategic. "From a business standpoint," said Alex Park, our head of strategic development, "acquiring Pinnacle's assets would accelerate our growth by 18 to 24 months. Their client contracts alone are worth more than the $400,000 Jonathan is asking. But from a symbolic standpoint?" I asked. "It depends on how we frame the acquisition," Marcus replied. "If we present it as Summit Strategic, growing large enough to absorb failed competitors, it reinforces our success story. If we present it as business as usual consolidation, it diminishes the connection between Pinnacle's discriminatory practices and their ultimate failure. What's your recommendation? Acquire the assets, but make it clear that we're doing so because ethical employment practices and authentic relationship management created sustainable competitive advantage over discrimination and credit appropriation." The team was unanimous in supporting the acquisition, but they wanted to ensure that buying Pinnacle's remaining assets didn't obscure the lessons their bankruptcy should teach other companies about the business consequences of employment discrimination. I called Jonathan the next morning to accept his terms with one modification. "I'll acquire Pinnacle's assets for $400,000, with the understanding that Summit Strategic will publicly acknowledge this acquisition as an example of how ethical business practices can succeed completely enough to absorb competitors who relied on discriminatory employment, exploitative credit taking. That's acceptable. But Natalie, I want to add something to our agreement. What? I want to include a public statement acknowledging that Pinnacle's bankruptcy resulted directly from employment discrimination and the business consequences that followed from that discrimination. You want to admit publicly that discriminating against me caused your company's failure? I want to ensure that other business leaders understand the connection between employment practices and competitive sustainability. If our failure can prevent other companies from making similar mistakes, then at least some good comes from this situation. The acquisition was finalized within a week. Summit Strategic Consulting officially acquired the remaining assets of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for $400,000, while both companies issued public statements acknowledging the business consequences of pregnancy discrimination and the competitive advantages of ethical employment practices. The local business journal covered the acquisition as a cautionary tale about how workplace discrimination could backfire when talented employees had the resources to build competitive alternatives. The article positioned Summit Strategic as an example of how companies could succeed by prioritizing family-friendly policies and authentic relationship management over exploitation and credit appropriation. But the most satisfying aspect of the acquisition wasn't the business growth or competitive victory. It was the knowledge that Pinnacle's bankruptcy had created a clear precedent for other employment discrimination cases and a demonstration that markets could effectively correct discriminatory behavior. As I signed the final acquisition documents, I reflected on how completely my situation had been transformed. 6 months ago, I'd been fired for pregnancy discrimination with no resources, except my knowledge of employment law and my determination to hold them accountable. Today, I was acquiring the company that had discriminated against me, while being recognized as a regional leader in ethical business practices and competitive strategy. Amanda Walsh had tried to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of her industry's most successful consultancy and established a precedent that would protect other women from similar discrimination for years to come. 3 months after acquiring Pinnacle's assets, Summit Strategic Consulting had grown to 25 employees and occupied 2 floors of the downtown business center. The former Pinnacle office space had been transformed into our family services division, complete with on-site childcare, lactation facilities, and flexible work arrangements that explicitly supported employees who chose to start families. The morning brought the call I'd been anticipating since agreeing to deliver the keynote address at the Regional Business Association's annual conference. Patricia Blackwood, the attorney who'd negotiated Pinnacle's discrimination settlement, was on the line with news that would add another layer to my story. Miss Williams, I wanted to inform you that your case has been cited in 3 other pregnancy discrimination lawsuits this quarter, and 2 companies have proactively revised their maternity leave policies specifically to avoid the business consequences Pinnacle experienced. What kind of business consequences? Client losses, employee departures, and reputation damage that made discrimination more expensive than accommodation would have been. Your case demonstrated that pregnancy discrimination isn't just illegal, it's economically catastrophic. Patricia's call confirmed what I'd hoped would result from our public documentation of Pinnacle's discriminatory practices and their ultimate business failure. Other companies were learning that firing employees for pregnancy could cost more than providing family-friendly accommodations. Patricia, have you seen changes in how your firm advises clients about employment decisions related to pregnancy? Absolutely. We now explicitly discuss the Summit Strategic case study when clients consider terminating pregnant employees. Your business success made discrimination a competitive liability rather than a cost-saving strategy. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at Summit Strategic. Diana Foster from Quantum Technologies arrived with her teenage daughter, who was working on a school project about women in business. Miss Williams, the daughter said, I'm writing about successful businesswomen who overcame discrimination to build companies. Can you tell me about your experience? What would you like to know? My mom said you were fired for being pregnant, but then you used the lawsuit money to start a company that became bigger than the one that fired you. Is that right? That's right. How did you know you could build a successful business? I didn't know, but I knew that companies that discriminate against employees for starting families were making strategic mistakes that created opportunities for competitors who operated more ethically. And you thought other clients would want to work with a company that treated families better? I thought talented employees would want to work for a company that didn't punish them for having children, and that clients would prefer working with agencies that operated based on integrity rather than discrimination and credit stealing. The teenager's questions reminded me how much my perspective had evolved since the day Amanda Walsh fired me in that conference room. What had started as a response to personal discrimination had become a demonstration of how ethical business practices could create sustainable competitive advantage. That evening, I reviewed the keynote speech I'd prepared for the Regional Business Association conference. The presentation used Summit Strategic's growth and Pinnacle's bankruptcy as a case study in how employment discrimination could backfire when talented employees had the resources and determination to build competitive alternatives. But as I rehearsed the speech, I realized that the most important message wasn't about revenge or business success. It was about the precedent we'd established for other women who might face similar discrimination. My phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Williams? This is Jessica Torres from Marketing Dynamics in Portland. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I got your number from the Business Association. Not at all. What can I do for you? I was recently fired by my agency after announcing my pregnancy. My attorney mentioned your case as an example of how discrimination lawsuits could provide resources for starting competitive businesses. Have you filed a discrimination complaint? We're preparing the documentation, but I wanted to ask whether you thought the consulting model you developed could work in other markets. Jessica, I think any market with pregnancy discrimination and agencies that take credit for other people's work could support consultancies that operate more ethically. Would you be willing to share advice about building a business plan around ethical employment practices and authentic client relationships? I'd be happy to discuss that with you. Jessica's call represented something I'd never anticipated when I started planning my response to Pinnacle's discrimination. My experience was becoming a template for other women who faced similar situations, providing both strategic guidance and proof that discrimination could be transformed into competitive advantage. Over the following weeks, I received calls from women in 4 other cities who'd been fired or marginalized because of pregnancy. Each conversation revealed similar patterns: agencies that prioritized short-term cost savings over employee accommodation, management that viewed pregnancy as a business liability, and talented women who had the skills and relationships necessary to build competitive alternatives. By the time I delivered the keynote address at the Regional Business Association conference, I understood that my story had become part of a larger transformation in how business communities thought about employment, discrimination, and competitive strategy. 6 months ago, I told the audience of business leaders, I was fired for being pregnant. Today, I'm delivering this keynote because pregnancy discrimination created the catalyst for building the most successful marketing consultancy in our region. The presentation included detailed analysis of Summit Strategic's growth, Pinnacle's bankruptcy, and the business consequences that flowed from discriminatory employment decisions. But the most important part was the message about precedent and possibility. The lesson isn't that discrimination creates opportunities for revenge, I concluded. The lesson is that talented employees who face discrimination often have the skills and relationships necessary to build competitive alternatives, and markets will reward ethical business practices over discriminatory ones when the competition is direct and well executed. The response was overwhelmingly positive, but the question that mattered most came from a woman in the audience. Miss Williams, what advice would you give to other women who face pregnancy discrimination but don't have the resources to start their own businesses? Document everything. Find legal representation that specializes in employment law, and remember that discrimination settlements can provide startup capital for competitive responses. But most importantly, understand that your skills and relationships are valuable assets that discriminatory employers are choosing to lose. As I drove home from the conference, I reflected on how completely my understanding of the situation had evolved. What had started as personal revenge had become a business model that other women could adapt to their own circumstances and markets. Amanda Walsh had fired me to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of a precedent that would protect other women from similar discrimination while demonstrating that ethical employment practices created sustainable competitive advantage. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't the business success or legal precedent. It was the knowledge that my daughter would grow up in a business community where pregnancy discrimination was understood to be not just illegal and immoral, but economically catastrophic. 9 months after my termination, I was preparing for the most significant presentation of my career when an unexpected phone call changed my understanding of how far the ripple effects of my case had spread. Elizabeth Chen was calling with news that would reshape how I thought about the precedent we'd established. "Natalie, I wanted you to know that the Department of Labor has reached out about featuring your case in their national guidelines for pregnancy discrimination prevention." What does that mean? It means that Summit Strategic's business success and Pinnacle's bankruptcy are being used as a federal case study for why accommodation is more cost-effective than discrimination. They want to use our story as official government guidance. They want to use your story as evidence that pregnancy discrimination creates business liabilities that extend far beyond legal settlements. Your case demonstrates market consequences that most companies never consider when making discriminatory employment decisions. Elizabeth's news arrived the same week I was scheduled to present Summit Strategic's annual results to our investors and advisory board. The numbers were impressive. $4.2 million in revenue, 28 employees, and a client retention rate of 96%. But more important than the financial success was the cultural impact we'd achieved. "The remarkable thing about Summit Strategic," said Carolyn Morrison during my presentation, "isn't just the business growth. It's the demonstration that ethical employment practices and authentic relationship management create sustainable competitive advantage over discrimination and credit appropriation." "What do you mean by sustainable competitive advantage?" asked Thomas Bradford, who joined our advisory board after Meridian Financial's successful transition to our consulting model. "I mean that companies trying to compete against Summit Strategic have to choose between adopting similarly ethical practices or accepting that they'll lose talent and clients to organizations that operate more responsibly." The presentation included analysis of how our approach had influenced employment practices throughout the regional marketing industry. 7 agencies had revised their maternity leave policies, 3 had implemented family-friendly workplace accommodations, and 2 had specifically recruited employees by emphasizing their commitment to supporting working parents. "You've created market pressure for ethical employment practices," observed Diana Foster. "Companies that discriminate against pregnant employees now risk losing competitive advantage to businesses that operate more responsibly." But the most meaningful feedback came from Marcus, who'd been tracking the career outcomes of former Pinnacle employees. "Natalie, I've been researching what happened to the people who worked at Pinnacle when you were fired. The results are interesting." "What kind of results?" 12 of the 15 employees who remained after your termination have since left the company or been laid off due to the bankruptcy. But 8 of them specifically mentioned Summit Strategic and your discrimination case as inspiration for prioritizing family-friendly employment in their job searches. So our success influenced their career decisions? Your success taught them that companies which discriminate against employees for starting families create competitive vulnerabilities that can be exploited by more ethical competitors. Marcus's research revealed something I'd never anticipated. My response to discrimination had influenced not just other women facing similar situations, but employees throughout the industry who were evaluating potential employers based on their commitment to family-friendly practices. That afternoon, I received a call from Angela Foster, the business journalist who'd covered Summit Strategic's growth and Pinnacle's bankruptcy. "Natalie, I'm working on a follow-up article about the broader impact of your case, and I wanted to ask about something interesting I've discovered. What have you found?" "I've identified 6 women in other cities who've used discrimination settlements to start consulting businesses that compete directly against agencies that fired them for pregnancy. They're all citing your case as the model they followed. 6 women, and growing. There's apparently a network developing among women who've transformed pregnancy discrimination into competitive business opportunities. They're sharing strategies, legal resources, and business development approaches based on your experience." Angela's article, published 2 weeks later, positioned my case as the catalyst for a national trend of women responding to pregnancy discrimination by building competitive businesses that succeeded through ethical employment practices and superior client service. But the real validation came when I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible 9 months earlier. "Miss Williams, this is Dr. Patricia Wong from the Harvard Business School. We're developing a case study about ethical employment practices and competitive strategy for our MBA curriculum, and we'd like to feature Summit Strategic's growth and business model. What aspect of our business model interests you? The demonstration that companies can achieve sustainable competitive advantage by prioritizing family-friendly employment practices over cost minimization strategies that rely on discrimination. And you want to use this as a teaching case for MBA students? We want to use your experience as evidence that ethical business practices create market opportunities that extend far beyond legal compliance or moral obligation. The Harvard case study would position Summit Strategic as an example of how talented employees could transform employment discrimination into competitive advantage through strategic business development and ethical operational practices. As I prepared my presentation for the Harvard research team, I reflected on how completely my situation had been transformed since that morning when Amanda Walsh fired me in front of the entire executive team. What had started as personal humiliation had become a business model being studied at the nation's most prestigious business school. What had begun as illegal discrimination had become a federal case study for why accommodation was more profitable than elimination. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't the academic recognition or business success. It was the knowledge that my daughter would inherit a business community where pregnancy discrimination was understood to be economically catastrophic rather than strategically advantageous. Amanda Walsh had tried to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of the most documented case study in business history of how discrimination could backfire when talented employees had the resources and determination to build competitive alternatives. And in exactly 1 week, I would welcome my daughter into a world where her mother had successfully proven that pregnancy and professional success weren't just compatible, they could be the foundation for competitive advantage. The call came at 4:27 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 10 months after Amanda Walsh had fired me for being pregnant. The contractions had started 3 hours earlier, but I'd waited until they were regular and strong before waking Marcus with the news that our presentation to the Harvard Business School would need to be rescheduled. "Are you sure you want to work today?" Marcus asked, as I reviewed client emails between contractions. Most people would consider active labor a valid reason to postpone business meetings. "I'm not most people," I replied, sending a final email to Caroline Morrison about Titanium Industries' quarterly campaign review. Besides, I want to finish the Harvard case study before Isabella arrives. Isabella Catherine Williams was born at 2:17 p.m., weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with dark hair and the determined expression of someone who'd already proven that pregnancy discrimination was the worst business decision her mother's former employer had ever made. As I held my daughter for the first time, I thought about the conversation that had started this entire journey, Amanda Walsh telling Jonathan Hayes that they needed to transition me out before the maternity leave became a problem. Looking at Isabella's perfect face, I couldn't imagine viewing her existence as anything other than the greatest blessing of my life. But more than personal satisfaction, Isabella's birth represented the completion of something much larger than revenge or business success. She was arriving into a world where her mother had successfully established that pregnancy discrimination was not just illegal and immoral, but economically catastrophic. 3 days later, I was working from my hospital bed when Elizabeth Chen called with news that would add the final chapter to our case study. "Natalie, I have something remarkable to tell you about the impact your case is having on employment law." "What's happened?" "The Department of Labor has officially incorporated Summit Strategic's business model into their best practices guidance for pregnancy accommodation. Your case is now federal precedent for how discrimination creates competitive liabilities. They're recommending that companies accommodate pregnancy to avoid competitive disadvantage. They're recommending that companies view pregnancy accommodation as investment in talent retention and competitive advantage rather than cost management and liability avoidance." Elizabeth's news meant that Isabella was being born into a legal framework that explicitly recognized pregnancy as a business asset rather than a problem to be eliminated. The Harvard Business School case study was published 6 weeks after Isabella's birth, featuring Summit Strategic as an example of how ethical employment practices could create sustainable competitive advantage over discriminatory business models. The case was titled "When Discrimination Backfires: How Pregnancy Termination Created a Competitive Threat," but the most meaningful recognition came in a letter I received from a woman I'd never met. "Dear Miss Williams," the letter began, "I'm writing to thank you for the precedent you established when you transformed your pregnancy discrimination case into a successful business. Last month, I was fired for announcing my pregnancy. This week, I filed my discrimination complaint and started developing my business plan based on the model you created. I wanted you to know that your daughter is being born into a world where pregnancy discrimination is no longer an acceptable business practice, largely because of what you accomplished. The letter was signed by Jessica Torres from Portland, the woman who'd called months earlier asking for advice about responding to pregnancy discrimination through competitive business development. Isabella's first month coincided with Summit Strategic's most successful quarter in company history. We'd secured 8 new clients, hired 4 additional employees, and established a waiting list of companies interested in working with our consultancy. More importantly, we'd established a track record that demonstrated the sustainable competitive advantage of ethical employment practices. But the real test of our success came when I received an unexpected call from someone whose name I'd hoped never to hear again. Natalie, this is Amanda Walsh. I hope it's appropriate for me to call. Amanda's voice was different than I remembered, less confident, more tentative, as if she understood that our relative positions had fundamentally shifted. Amanda, this is unexpected. I wanted to congratulate you on your daughter's birth and to acknowledge what you've accomplished with Summit Strategic. Thank you. But I also wanted to apologize for the decisions I made regarding your employment. I realize now that firing you was not just legally wrong, but strategically catastrophic for everyone involved. What do you mean? I mean that I cost Pinnacle their most valuable employee, destroyed client relationships that had taken years to develop, and created a competitor that ultimately eliminated our business entirely. Amanda's apology was more complete than I'd expected, but it also revealed something important about how our situation had been perceived by the people who'd participated in my discrimination. Amanda, do you understand why I built Summit Strategic instead of just taking the settlement money and moving on? I understand that you wanted to prove that the approaches that led to your termination were unsustainable and that ethical employment practices could generate better results. And you think I succeeded in proving that? I think you succeeded so completely that companies throughout the region have revised their employment practices to avoid the competitive consequences Pinnacle experienced. Amanda's conversation confirmed what I'd suspected about the broader impact of my case. The business consequences of Pinnacle's discrimination had influenced employment practices far beyond our individual situation. As Isabella slept peacefully in her crib beside my desk, I finished the final report for the Harvard Business School case study. The document chronicled everything from the moment of my termination through Summit Strategic's emergence as the regional leader in ethical marketing services. But the most important section focused on precedent and possibility, how my experience had established a framework for other women facing similar discrimination, and how markets could effectively correct discriminatory behavior when talented employees had the resources to build competitive responses. The case study concluded with a simple observation: employment discrimination creates competitive opportunities for ethical alternatives when victims have the skills, relationships, and resources necessary to exploit those opportunities. As I submitted the final report, I realized that my journey from fired employee to industry leader had created something more valuable than business success or personal vindication. It had established proof that pregnancy and professional achievement were not just compatible, but could be the foundation for competitive advantage that extended far beyond individual circumstances. Amanda Walsh had fired me to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of the most successful marketing consultancy in the region, a federal case study in business ethics, and a legal precedent that would protect other women from similar discrimination. But most importantly, she'd ensured that my daughter would grow up understanding that pregnancy was a source of strength rather than professional liability, and that discrimination could always be transformed into competitive advantage through intelligence, determination, and strategic response. Isabella Catherine Williams was born into a world where her mother had proven that some people are much more dangerous when they're underestimated than when they're appreciated. 6 months after Isabella's birth, Summit Strategic Consulting had grown to 35 employees and was featured on the cover of Regional Business Magazine as the consultancy that changed how companies think about family and competition. The article positioned our success as evidence that ethical employment practices created sustainable competitive advantage over discriminatory business models. The morning brought a call that would provide the perfect conclusion to my transformation from discriminated employee to industry leader. Doctor, Patricia Wong from Harvard Business School was inviting me to deliver a guest lecture to MBA students about competitive strategy and ethical employment practices. Professor Williams, she said, using the honorary title that had accompanied my appointment as a Harvard Business School case study contributor, we'd like you to present Summit Strategic's business model as an example of how market forces can correct discriminatory employment practices. What aspects of our model do you want me to emphasize? The demonstration that talented employees who face discrimination often have the skills and relationships necessary to build competitive alternatives, and that markets will reward ethical business practices when the competition is direct and well executed. The Harvard lecture took place on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after my termination from Pinnacle Marketing. As I stood before a lecture hall filled with future business leaders, I reflected on how completely my situation had been transformed. 12 months ago, I told the MBA students, I was fired for being pregnant. Today, I'm here because that discrimination created the catalyst for building the most successful marketing consultancy in our region and establishing precedent that has influenced employment practices nationally. The presentation included detailed analysis of Summit Strategic's growth trajectory, competitive strategy, and the business consequences that had flowed from Pinnacle's discriminatory employment decisions. But the most important section focused on lessons for future business leaders. The case study you'll read tonight demonstrates several key principles, I continued. First, discrimination creates competitive vulnerabilities that can be exploited by more ethical competitors. Second, talented employees who face discrimination often have the skills and relationships necessary to build competitive alternatives. And third, markets will reward ethical employment practices over discriminatory ones when the competition is direct and transparent. During the question period, a student asked the most important question of the entire presentation. Professor Williams, do you think your success was primarily due to market forces correcting discriminatory behavior, or was it more about your individual skills and determination? Both. Market forces created the opportunity by making discrimination expensive and ethically problematic. But individual skills and determination were necessary to exploit that opportunity effectively. And you think other women in similar situations could follow your model? I think any talented employee who faces discrimination has the potential to transform that discrimination into competitive advantage, assuming they have access to legal resources and business development support. The lecture was videotaped and distributed through Harvard Business School's online curriculum, making Summit Strategic's business model available to MBA students worldwide as an example of how ethical employment practices could create sustainable competitive advantage. But the most meaningful recognition came in a letter I received from the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Dear Miss Williams, the letter began, we are writing to inform you that Summit Strategic Consulting has been selected as a model employer for federal contractors seeking to implement best practices in pregnancy, accommodation, and family-friendly workplace policies. The designation meant that Summit Strategic's employment practices would be studied and emulated by companies working with the federal government, extending our influence far beyond the regional marketing industry. That evening, I returned home to find Isabella playing with blocks in the living room while Marcus prepared dinner. The ordinary domestic scene felt extraordinary when I considered how dramatically our lives had been transformed by my decision to fight pregnancy discrimination through competitive business development. How did the Harvard lecture go? Marcus asked. Better than I expected. The students were particularly interested in the replicability of our model. Do you think other women can follow your approach? I think other women with similar skills and access to resources can adapt our approach to their specific circumstances and markets. And you think that creates systemic change rather than just individual success? I think successful examples of ethical business practices create market pressure for broader adoption of those practices. As Isabella babbled happily while stacking blocks, I realized that she was growing up in a business community that had been fundamentally changed by her mother's response to pregnancy discrimination. The phone rang with a call from Elizabeth Chen, who had news about the continuing impact of our case. Natalie, I wanted you to know that pregnancy discrimination settlements increased by 67% nationally last quarter, and 7 of those cases specifically cited Summit Strategic as evidence that accommodation was more cost-effective than termination. So other women are using our precedent successfully? Other women are using your precedent to demonstrate that discrimination creates competitive liabilities that extend far beyond legal settlements. That's exactly what we hoped would happen. As I tucked Isabella into her crib that night, I reflected on the year that had transformed me from a fired employee into a nationally recognized example of how ethical employment practices could create competitive advantage. Amanda Walsh had fired me to eliminate what she saw as a maternity leave problem. Instead, she'd catalyzed the creation of a business model that was being studied at Harvard Business School, implemented by federal contractors, and replicated by women throughout the country. But most importantly, she'd ensured that Isabella would inherit a business community where pregnancy discrimination was understood to be not just illegal and immoral, but economically catastrophic and competitively suicidal. The last thing I did before going to sleep was update the timeline that had been hanging in my office since the day I started Summit Strategic. The final entry read, Month 12, Harvard Business School case study published, federal contractor designation received. Precedent established for transforming discrimination into competitive advantage. Below that, I added one final note. Isabella Catherine Williams, born into a world where pregnancy discrimination is economically catastrophic rather than strategically advantageous. The transformation was complete. What had started as personal humiliation had become a business model that would influence employment practices for generations. What had begun as illegal discrimination had become the foundation for the most successful marketing consultancy in our region's history. Amanda Walsh thought she was eliminating a problem employee who might cost the company maternity leave expenses. Instead, she'd created the most documented case study in business history of how discrimination could backfire when talented employees had the resources and determination to build competitive alternatives. Sometimes the best revenge is building something so much better that everyone has to acknowledge the superiority of your approach, including the people who originally underestimated you, and sometimes that revenge becomes the foundation for systemic change that extends far beyond individual satisfaction to create a better world for your children.